Well, hi there. I'm here with a friend of mine and colleague, Mark LoGalbo, who is the head or VP of Security, Information Security at Fanatics, which is obviously a name that many will know. And we're here today to talk about some very interesting stuff around compliance and data governance. But before we get into that, Mark, do you want to just give everyone a brief background as to how you've come into this area? And then we'll lead into some of your thinking and explore that together.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. Well, thanks for inviting me to this. So, background, I suppose fairly interesting. I don't come from a traditional IT background, which a lot of people seem to transition through into information security kind of naturally. I started my career off British Army. I was in the Royal Military Police. Did a bit of civilian policing after that for a little while, and then I thought, one day I'll do something crazy. I'll move to America. And go join the US Army. So I spent a bit of time in the US Army where actually I learned about information security. So that's kind of where I picked it up from there. Came out of the US Army, probably spent about 12 years doing government contracting for the US government, various different agencies. Of those 12 years, about 7 of those years, I had my own company doing a lot of subcontracting to some of the larger contractors. And then I came back to the UK in 2010. And then since 2010, worked for a couple of different organizations, telecommunications, some product organizations, until recently, as you mentioned, with Fanatics. And I've been with them for about 2 years now, having an enormous amount of fun because I'm just a massive sports fan. So this kind of role for me is just like amazing role at the moment.
You're wearing your own use case here, aren't you?
Exactly. Yep, that's exactly it.
Well, let's talk about some wider areas here that I think you and I have had. I do not know how many cups of tea and coffee on and thrown around and debated and such. But Mark, I'm really interested in holistic security, as you know, and by that I mean where does it go wrong and what's the root cause? And obviously, one very large area that we've spent our time sort of musing on is supply chain. But there's been a lot of focus on supply chain, a lot of talk about it in the industry. It's a big theme, but is it really being addressed? So from a high level, how do you feel, and I'm talking generically in the industry here, how do you feel about supply chain management, especially as someone who's come into it from a non-IT perspective?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting subject, and we use supply chain, third-party risks, or vendors interchangeably. So I think, and I'll probably use vendors just because I'm more used to it. It is a fascinating subject. I mean, if I'm being honest, I don't think it quite has enough spotlight on it for improvements and what we need to really do with it. I get the feeling more from what I've seen previously, it's more of a checkbox exercise. It's something that's got to be done. We tend to throw large questionnaires at vendors that are pre-canned and just expect, a large amount of questionnaires back. We've done our job, we've asked for a policy and we've kind of moved on. So I think in the industry, really that needs to change. I think there is a lot of change coming. I think reducing those type of questionnaires, getting down to more what's the nitty gritty, and really helping to drive the business and try to make those assessments shorter, I think is probably key for us. But if you kind of look at a lot of the breaches, I mean, there is so many breaches, right? That is third party / vendor, kind of induced. We have heavy, reliance on these vendors, especially as we push more and more to the cloud, right? A lot more software as a service. Businesses are relying a lot more on third parties. So I think we've got to get smarter. And by that, I mean both looking at the information security side to protect the business, but also to actually help move the business forward, right? Because if we're too slow, if we're taking too long, the business will do what the business does. And that's unfortunately sometimes sidestep us if they can.
But okay, that's I've just filled my pad with questions just on that alone. And let's take a number of links around this. So you mentioned checkbox exercise, but you've said something that's really a phrase that puts the fear into me, which is we've done our job. And let me qualify that, Mark.
Yeah.
Do you find that sometimes the sort of GRC governance, auditing functions sometimes fall into this, we're just doing a job, and they lose the intent and the connectivity about what they are trying to achieve. It's just roll it out and get the answers, move on. Are we overloading them? Do they not care? Are they not engaged mentally here? Because supply chain is absolutely fundamental to any organization, isn't it? Or vendor risk management.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the people working in it know. My experience has been, several companies that I've been at, is the people that are actually doing the vendor management, highly professional. They want to do it. They're very passionate about it. I don't think that's the issue. I think maybe it's the flip side of it is maybe not so much thinking about balancing what they're trying to do with a true kind of, hey, this is black and white, right? We want to do the best job we can. Therefore, we are going to go and take a look at the vendor down to the final bit. We want to know everything about them. And rather not stepping back and thinking, okay, there's only so much I can do. How much am I really going to get out of a questionnaire compared to what am I doing for the business? Right? We're always kind of, always being told, right, support the business, support the business. Well, the business, especially when it comes to vendors, once they've got to a point where they want a vendor, it means they want them tomorrow, right? They want to sign the contract. They want to move on. This is not 6 months in the planning. They want it. So being told from a security team, hey, you're going to have to wait 6 weeks, 8 weeks while we do this. I mean, that's just, to them, total madness. So I think that's the bit that as practitioners ourselves, we have to constantly be thinking about, how do I balance that risk and reward, right? I'm constantly thinking risk as a practitioner. My business is thinking reward, and I need to balance those two out.
The two. So one answer to that clearly then would be to increase the time ahead of schedule. But then are we running the risk that, we're assessing too many vendors because they haven't been selected? You could end up with, quadruple the amount of work and try to be thorough and be early in that. Where's the balance in that, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in an ideal world, right? I mean, how I would love to see it, and we're seeing some organizations do this job really good, and some organizations have got a long way to go, right? In the ideal world, you don't want a business owner coming to you with a vendor. What you ideally want them going to is to something like a program management office, whether that sits in IT, whether that sits in procurement, wherever that program management office sits. And you want the business going to them and saying, I'm trying to do something, a business function, an improvement, an add-on, whatever it is. I've got an idea. This is what I want to do. And then talking through that process and talking to people in technology and IT and saying, how do I solve that? What's the best way forward? Because at the end of the day, they may, and maybe it's likely, they've already got a solution, right? We generally tend to have multiple vendors doing exactly the same thing. So I want another, I'm looking to bring a vendor on for CMS. If it went through a PMO process, it's kind of more of, well, yeah, we've got 2 of those approved on the shelf. Here you go. Here's one. Get on with it. So I think ideally, in an ideal world, that's what I would really look at, right? Trying to go through that PMO, trying to solve the problem first rather than just the vendor. And then I think, unfortunately, what tends to happen is there's maybe not a PMO process or a similar process in place. So business owners are going straight to, they're not informing information security, and generally because they honestly just don't know the process, right? To them, it's, hey, I want a vendor. I need to get this done. What are the roadblocks that are going to stop me? And then they tend to find out about these roadblocks. And unfortunately, information security often gets seen just as a roadblock rather than an enabler, which is what we want to turn this around to.
Right. This is so poignant. And funny enough, I'm doing a discussion with someone tomorrow around this specific theme, not GRC, not risk management, but more around roadblocks and workflow. So this person that I'm speaking to has done a lot of work around workflow, because information security, if not pre-planned, can create that perceived roadblock and therefore lack of trust or confidence and things like that. If it's in a well-defined workflow that helps people do their role and job and function correctly, then the workflow will naturally pull them through the steps required and is transparent rather than opaque.
Yeah.
And therein lies the issue. So what a very interesting point. So let's say we don't have roadblocks. We've got a proactive process.
Mhm.
We're looking at, exploring the right solution. Why is it then we go and do something else, which is almost create a sort of information capture roadblock, which is we go and ask prescriptive questions and there's no dynamic component to it whatsoever. Maybe the only dynamics I've ever seen, and I'm sure you'll smile when I say, is, you weren't able to complete, or it wasn't scored satisfactory in XYZ area, so therefore another 127 questions appear
Yeah.
drilling down. Is that the solution? Is that what we mean by dynamic, Mark, or is there opportunity for improvement here?
Oh, definitely. Always opportunity for improvement, right? I mean, at the current company, we've spent a lot of time streamlining our process, really thinking about the business owner, and really trying to get that done. And also thinking about the vendor, right? Because at the end of the day, you want to start thinking about how the vendor's going to react to this. It's a partnership, right? So you're not just trying to hit them over the head. You're ideally not just trying to catch them out. You're trying to do this as a true partnership. So I try and come at it from the vendor's point of contact perspective as well. Does it make sense for them? So, when we look at things like streamlining and stuff like that, a lot of these people have got compliance packages, right? They're ready to go. There's stuff that they're already used. It's their format. Do we really need to throw them another, 1,000 questions? I won't name a certain framework, right? But there's a few frameworks out there that give you specific canned questions. Do we really need to be doing those type of things, or is there a smarter way for us to be looking at due diligence? So that's the kind of areas that we focus on.
I agree with that. And it's an interesting one because I've got another two routes. I'll keep them shallow, but partnership, that word is magical to me. And it's something that is spoken about a lot in information security, but I think perhaps in practice is not. It's always, what can a vendor get out of a client? And there's so many reasons that behavior happens nowadays, especially sort of financial pressures, targets, and all those things. And it leads to a world of perhaps not as much trust, or certainly not enough neutrality in that, or perhaps the word I'm looking for here is integrity in that.
Yeah.
So what's your view, and what are the mechanisms that InfoSec can use to almost bring the partner around the desk and sit on the same side of the table and have just a really honest conversation about their standards of information security, and most importantly, where their gaps are that are always going to be there? How do we do that, and how do we then open up, our real understanding of their real material risk?
Yeah, I think it's always going to be challenging, right? Because obviously, as a vendor, if there's something there that's not quite up to scratch, they're not going to be forthcoming a lot of the times. I think the conversations we generally have had has been around, just those honest conversations at the beginning, right? Is, look, this is a partnership. We're not expecting your program to be perfect. We would love it if it was, but I still have not seen a perfect information security program from anybody. So I think it's really just homing in on that. And I think the other thing that's important for us as well is to realize we're not going to discover everything right up front. And that generally is because we don't have 6 months, right? It's not a merger and acquisition. We're not going to go in there with a full audit team. We're not going to be doing pen testing on a vendor. We're hoping that they've got independent pen testing and things like that. So we're not going to have time to do a lot of things ourselves, right? A lot of this is more as that initial upfront. Does it look good? Does it feel right? Have they got the right stuff in place? So I talk about the compliance packages and that kind of stuff. So I think it's just that honest conversation with them. At the end of the day, both companies want the relationship to work, right? They want to get the sale. We need the services, right? And there's likely something linked to, especially in our company where, we're obviously using a lot of our vendors to help support drive our business. So it's a two-way street. We both want to make sure we're doing it right. But from an information security perspective, we just want to make sure that our business is not making, the risk is too high. Has the vendor got certain practices in place? Is it enough for what we need? And I think that's also the key as well. Is it adequate? Is it realistic? Right? We can't vet the vendor exactly the same way for every vendor. We've got to take considerations of, typical, what type of data are we giving them? what level of access are we giving to our data? What are they actually doing for us? What's the size of the company, etc. So trying to combine all that. And I think if you've got a nice streamlined process and you're explaining that, I think that also helps bring down the walls of the vendors. And I think that's what we've found. We've spent, like I said, a lot of time trying to get to a good SLA, trying to get a streamlined process in place, trying to put emphasis more on continuous monitoring, right? Of doing that first level of review and then bringing that vendor in and continuously monitoring them. And I think once we've explained to them what we're doing, the feedback has been pretty positive. And I'd probably say, I think even walls have come down a little bit. Hey, we don't quite have that, but we know we need to work on it. Or what would you guys tell us to kind of focus on? Because again, some of these vendors don't have, if they do have a security team, it might be a security person, it might be an IT team. Obviously larger companies do have their own information security teams, but some of these vendors you're using, they don't always have an information security team. So they're trying their best. It's not like they're trying to do negative things to try and hurt you. It's just that maybe they're just not aware as much.
It's interesting, isn't it? So winding that back just slightly to get an outcome here, the smart vendor risk management process sets a context for that. Absolutely. And a pretext saying, help me help you. And there's always a risk within the risk assessment. It won't be perfect. There is a slight phrase that we've got. I love this. People are either giving you the evidence in 1 day or 1 hour, right, or 1 week. And it's always interesting because the 1 hour it's already ready and it's mature. The 1 week is because they're going to go and write it. And there's a lot to be seen in that. But how do you feel about this then, perhaps then when people do open up, if they do open up, and they actually say, actually, Mark, we have got some exposure here. That's a reality of the world, but we're managing it. Does that go for them? Or is it, I'm talking now, I think we need to be general in the industry, or is it better that a highly polished performance is delivered by a vendor? Where's the industry taking us here?
No, definitely, I'd say I would be more comfortable with the former, right? Because if somebody's got a highly polished thing, even if they give me, tons and tons of material to kind of show me that, I'm still suspicious, right? Because even working for, maybe I shouldn't say even working for the US government, but you think governments have got themselves, pretty well organized and protected, right? But it always makes me suspicious. So I think to me, it shows a more mature information security program with a vendor. If they've already identified something, if they're bringing that forward and say, okay, look, we have a shortcoming, we've got something that's not quite working, but we are managing it, and here's what we're doing. Well, I'm like, well, that's fantastic, because now I know, they've got some level of risk program. They're looking at their risks and issues. They understand it. They're managing those. And I think for me, it's about understanding, okay, well, tell me about it, right? What are you guys doing? How's that going to impact the services we're trying to get from you? What is the time scale? So if someone says, okay, I've got something missing here, but we're working on it, but we're going to have it in place in 3 months, and can give me those levels of assurance, I think for me, that goes a long way. At the end of the day, just reminding ourselves again, we're here as an information security team as a service to the business, right? So we recommend. We're not a black and white, we say yes or no to a vendor. That's not our decision. We make the recommendations back to either the business owner, to the procurement team, or if we feel that that risk is quite severe, then generally my experience has been, we've got an escalation path for that. But normally it's managed at the business level. Okay, this is what the vendor has said. They've identified a gap, a weakness. Here is their plan. They've got a plan of action. They've got some milestones. And here's what I'd recommend. And again, generally talking to those business owners, we try and keep it very much in business language, try and make it simple, try not to baffle them with lots of risk scores. And so for us, I've developed a very simple way of trying to explain that to them, and a simple way of scoring, so it's easy for them to understand as well.
That's really interesting. So the word you used was shortcomings. So shortcomings are real. Why do we therefore not ask clients? I don't recall in recent history ever seeing any form of due diligence saying, where are your deficiencies or your shortcomings?
Right.
Is it a fundamental question to ask?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I tend to look at it probably in two parts when I look at a vendor, right?
Hmm.
One is if they are providing a technology solution, right? Because not all of them are. There may be a service or something like that. So if they're providing a technology solution, I would have one part of the streamlined questionnaire. You're not going to get away with no questionnaire. You're obviously going to want to ask them some things. So I tend to focus those specifically around a solution and those big concerns like MFA, something like that, right? So specific things that I want to make sure they've got. So I will be able to identify if there's a shortcoming straight away. The other part of it I tend to use a lot more is attestations, right? So it's more from the vendor. Can you tell me, right? You understand the data we're giving you. Can you attest that you have, industry level controls in place, adequate, that's going to protect the type of data we're giving to you? Yes or no? So I've got them on the hook, right, as well, because they now know, well, hang on a minute, I'm putting something in writing that says, I'm now saying that. Yes, of course, it's usually contained within a document, a security agreement, a DPA or something like that. But I generally want it up front, nice and simple. Do you agree? Yes, no. Other things like I want to make sure they've got cyber liability insurance, right? That means a lot more to me than, have you got these 52 policies, right? Anyone can write a policy. Anyone can give me something, unless I'm going to sit there and read through every single one of them and then question them to make sure that it's true. I don't think it gives me a lot, right? So I think asking those attestation type questions, have you got cyber liability insurance? Is it up to the threshold that I think is adequate, right? So as a company, we will come up with that number and we will ask them if they've got it. And if not, why not? Again, I mentioned kind of compliance packages. If they don't have compliance packages, the standard, do you have an ISO 27001? Again, it's not a negative if they don't, but it's just indicative that someone's come out from a third party and looked at their security program. Made my job a little bit easier. I'm now a little bit more at ease. SOC 2 Type 2, definitely a massive bonus, especially, if it's a SaaS platform. I almost want to know why they don't have a SOC 2 Type 2 or a Type 3. So those kind of things, getting those off of them is kind of really helpful, but pushing it back on them, have you had a data breach in the last 5 years? Are you aware of any type of breach or incident that could affect our data that is ongoing right now? So just getting them where they're kind of going, well, hang on a minute. He's asked me to be truthful. Maybe I need to say something here. So that's the way we tend to go. And like I said, we try and do it much more on a streamlined process. We try and stick to an SLA for ourselves. And then that kind of continuous monitoring is important for us. But if we kind of bombard them with, look, here's 1,000 questions to kind of fill in, timing goes up. Am I really getting the truthful answers back on everything? Or if this is the first time they've seen the questionnaire, is somebody on the other end just going along and just checking it because they need to get the sale?
Interesting. What's the phrase we use here? The control was described with good intent. Put it that way.
Yes.
It's people always in these processes generally tend to skew to the positive aspect of the shortcoming rather than the negative side, right?
We're human, right? So I mean, and there's got to be a level of verification. So we would definitely do our homework. One of the things I always tell my guys before you do anything, right? You've got a vendor. Go take a look at their website, right? Go do some Googling about the company. It's amazing how much information you can find out. If you've got the luxuries, I mean, we do, but if you've got the luxury of having some, cyber rating platforms or something like that, there's various out there. I've got my favorites, won't mention them, but there's lots of cybersecurity rating platforms. We use that a lot as well. Again, I wouldn't trust everything 100%. There's always false positives, false negatives, but it gives you those red flags. And I think that's when you're looking at vendors, that's what you're really looking for, right? It's the red flags. And if a vendors start getting, oh, there's a red flag there, oh, there's another one there, now you're starting to build that picture, right? So that's what helps you, rather than let me go through every single one of these. Oh, they answered no to that. All right, let me pull that one up. So I think that's the way we've got to try and move, really.
Your smile, though, just a few moments ago, kind of revealed something else, which I find incredibly important, which is there is a huge function of experience behind this as well, isn't there? In assessing these red flags, the tools, the audit may give you the red flag, but it's it's the decision maker that sits behind that sort of then, knows what to drill into. And then, Mark, there's another element, which is the commercial function of that, which is, okay, so let's say there are a variety of red flags. Let's say there are shortcomings. That's real. There's a process and a program around it. You mentioned kind of corrective action around that, and wearing that liability themselves. So 2 questions around that is, this is an opportunity to perhaps address it through some commercial terms, some legal terms, and put that. So question, or part 1 of my question. Part 2 of my question is it's an interesting one because it's undefined. Cyber liability insurance, very interesting, but it relies on the fact that they've been full and truthful, and it's an accurate and full and fair picture that they've given. So let's say they do a test and they have got the insurance. Therefore, we upstream can place reliance on that. But then in the real world, if something fails, if they're found to be in void or, not in the spirit of their insurance, they actually may be under or uninsured, even though we've done our due diligence checks. How do we deal with that? The legal and the commercial, and then the reliance on goodwill around cyber insurance, even if it's in our hand as the certificate.
I think it's the best we can, right? I'm going to be honest. I don't think there's a perfect situation, right? You do the best you can. You reduce the level of risk of bringing that vendor on just as much as you can and manage as you can. So you're right. You said contractual terms. Exactly. So if you see in there and you've got the luxury of adding those to contractual terms, then fantastic, right? We have a standard set of information security terms for our vendors. We're lucky that our legal team supports us very strongly. So we get that document in front of the vendor as quick as we can. And to, because again, that's another part of our assessment, right? If the vendor's pushing back on our legal terms, ours is usually contained within a DPA, or it stands alone from a DPA if we're not using a DPA, the very infrequent times we do. That's the other red flags, right? Let's see what they're pushing back on. Hang on a minute, they don't like the right to audit. Well, why don't you like the right to audit? I mean, the chances of me actually physically coming to you are pretty small anyway, but you're giving me, again, another red flag. I may want to spend some time rather than coming to you in audit. We may just do it online like we are today. So I think looking at those, I think really helps. So yes, getting stuff in contractual terms, looking at red flags in contractual terms is really important. And then again, I think using that, again, like I said, the continuous monitoring part. So for us, if we identify issues with the vendor, I use that term. And by issues, it could be vulnerabilities, policies, anything we don't like that doesn't meet the standards. So for instance, if someone comes back to me and says, hey, we have cyber liability insurance, but it's 100,000. Okay, well, that's not really going to do a lot for me, right? You've got it, well done, check, box, but it's 100,000. So I'm probably going to write that up as an issue towards the business owner. I think taking those issues, what we tend to do is take those issues and then map them to a risk. Again, we like everything simple. I know some organizations get pretty complex. We move at pace, and most of the organizations I've worked for move at pace. And therefore, we've got to make sure our risk management moves at pace. So I tend to group those issues together, create a risk, which the risk is around generally the one vendor themselves. So I haven't got a risk register of thousands and thousands of risks. And then we do something about those issues, right? So we talk to the vendor. Here's the issues we've identified. We need to do this, this, and this. Are you open for that? Let's work out a quick plan of action so I can present that to the business owner, right? And we'll track those as part of our risk remediation. And then I'll let the business owner know what they are and how we can manage them. So that's the kind of 2 areas that we tend to handle those kind of stuff. But absolutely, the contractual agreement can do an enormous amount for you if you can get it in there.
I love your point about continuous monitoring it. How many times have you and I seen in our careers where a vendor has passed the audit?
Yeah,
at the end of that.
Exactly. So one shot, they've now been forgotten.
Right.
Yeah.
In fact, actually, Mark, I had a meeting this morning, and this is definitely going to be an area I'm going to explore very, very soon, which is, post-purchase of a solution, both in terms of controls and efficacy of those controls, effectiveness, efficacy, but also now I think I'll add to that and add continuous monitoring of supplier from a due diligence perspective as well. So not just what their solution is doing for us, because no one seems to, there's always a peak, isn't there? Winding up into an event, that event is then done and then goes quiet and then they just use the service, but no one looks at that. The efficacy kind of side. So how important and how frequent, or what's the matrix that goes through your mind of how a continuous monitoring regime should be put in place for existing onboarded vendors?
Yeah. I think it's got to be realistic, right? Because I think, fantastic those security organizations that are out there that have got large cybersecurity teams. They probably have a lot of regulatory compliance issues around it, which drives their security program. Therefore, they get the funding for it. Fantastic, right? But for most of us out there, the majority of us out there in the industry, we don't have mass budgets, right? GRC teams are generally small. They need to be nimble. So you've got to pick and choose your battles, right? So I think with vendors, you've got to be able to do what's realistic for us. So for us, I tend to look at, obviously we're focusing on those critical vendors. We can't monitor every single vendor. So I say that we do a level of some small monitoring. So again, using platforms, using automation. So again, when I go back to the cyber risk platforms, you can certainly use those and just set up some basics around. They're pretty good, right? And if there's a breach recorded from that company, maybe that's what's alerting you, right? Maybe that's all you can do with all of your vendors, right? You see a breach in the industry, the rating platform will let you know, and you can have that an automated response. We tend to look at all of our critical vendors. So again, we're using as much automation as possible for looking for those red flags, right? So if we see their scores drop down, all of a sudden their vulnerability management from what we can see from the outside, the public side, that starts, dropping down by 2 points or something in a month, then we can set those parameters of what do we want? What type of vendor are they? Do they have our data? What type of data they have? Those kind of stuff. And then we just try and use as much automation as possible, right? So if we're getting those scores, bringing them into our GRC platform, flagging it as an issue, that going up to a risk and helping us manage that, trying to take as much away from the human element. We still need to make those decisions, right? We still need to look at it, but just trying to get the automation side of things. And hopefully, obviously, as a completely another subject, but obviously we've got one eye towards AI and that kind of stuff as well. But at the moment, we're focused a lot more on automation, although we are dabbling a little bit in AI when it comes to vendors as well. That's helping us more with the documentation, because some vendors do still have those 1,000 questionnaires that are already pre-canned. I don't know about anyone else, but I don't particularly want to go through every single one of them. So we are starting to look at the use of AI to help pass out that type of information and give us those red flags.
Yeah, I mean, people get excited about AI in that respect, but at the end of the day, you call it macro, call it a filter, call it a workflow, how it's powered is still the same, isn't it? So, it's
Absolutely.
just a productivity tool. So really, to summarize there, workflow is crucial to this function of surveillance and continuous monitoring. Critical vendors, maybe skewing those and focusing about perhaps a bit more depth and frequency, and score surveillance can be very, very useful as well. There's a lovely phrase I like in this area, which is don't just tell me, show me. And very interestingly, a few weeks ago, when we go through these audits, we've done a lot of work. In fact, we spent nearly a year before we launched building all this stuff in advance, so then you can grow into these systems, because we knew it was coming. And experience over the last, many years has told us get this part of the house in order. It's incredibly important before growth. So we always volunteer and say, we warmly welcome a face-to-face audit and an interactive audit. Come and see this stuff. And lo and behold, someone actually said, I'd like to see. And we were shocked, Mark. Now, we get asked a lot of questions, a lot of very in-depth things, show us documentation, not just the policies, but show us when were they last updated? How can you show that people are complying with them? Give me the evidence trail around your actual ongoing compliance, which I love. And we put in place operational board meetings on a monthly basis. Every single week, we look at our risk register, those cadence activities, so we can evidence that. But how often do you actually see that people are really that effective, or are they just doing the bare minimums and then focusing on their main business?
That's such a wide question, right? Because it
I know.
really, because there's a lot of really mature organizations out there. And I
Yeah.
think if they've got a dedicated information security team, we tend to find they're doing it, right? There's plenty of vendors out there doing really good work. And they've got it. And then just unfortunately, there are some vendors that just don't have the staff, haven't got any of that in place. So exactly that, as we kind of look at ourselves, we're always looking inwardly and thinking, okay, if we got audited or something happened, right? So we make sure we got a really strong control framework, and we're doing that, right? That supports all of this, so that you've got all that evidence, to back up in case you do. But it's really is a mixed bag that's out there. And I'd say, when I go out there, it's so wide. It really depends on the size of the company, what they do as an organization, and how much emphasis they put in that. But we see ranges from, not really any. They're just focusing on what they can get away with for that questionnaire, through to very, very mature processes.
That's very interesting. I've always had the mindset, be always open to have the auditor come in, bring them in proactively, learn from it. But there are some very strange questions that you do get sometimes, such as well, prove that the standard of encryption is sufficient. Some things we go out and eat at a restaurant. There's some basic hygiene things in life that you have to take as a given. Air is breathable, food is consumable. So it is fascinating when auditors go down into that level.
But that's the kind of thing you can do in your continuous monitoring, right? If you kind of tier your vendors, sorry, and you focus, your top level ones over time in that continuous monitoring, you've got it in your agreement that you can go there, and every year you can kind of pick an area and say to them, okay, look, we're doing this. We're not picking on you. We're picking on an area. And like you said, to encryption, right? So can you give us this type of screenshot? You've got to be very clear as to the evidence you're looking for. Get them on a Zoom call, be very honest. If they're a regular companies, they should be used to it. They've got their own security team. It's exactly what they've probably gone out, looked for their own controls, and just be like, look, this is the bit I'm looking for. We need to dig down in this particular area. So I've seen that work to really well as well.
Well, that's good, isn't it? Because that's now addressing that word earlier of integrity, standards, goodwill, which should be there in any proper partnership and underpins it. I've got one final question for you, which is it's around a specific control, not the specific standard itself, but if we look at SOC 2 Type 2 as an example, one thing that concerns me from a transparency perspective isn't the framework, but it's everyone that de-scopes, because they then have a service provider. And so it's not the standard, it's the mechanism that performs. So we take a very simple example, you and I go and buy a service together, and it's got the certification, it's all up to date, they've had the audit, and it's SOC 2 Type 2, and we've got all the evidence. But then we look within that, and then when people do, it's quite fascinating, isn't it? Because
Absolutely.
so much see within this is, well, that's a service that provided to us, and that's de-scoped. And I have seen something that's almost thoroughly de-scoped, which was just truly alarming. Are they compliant? Yes. Have they met the intent of the requirements? Yes. Is it safe? I'm not going to trust it. What do you think?
No, I completely agree. Devil's in the details. It's, SOC 2, same as ISO 27001, right? You've got to look at the details. What is the scope, right? What did they put it around? What is the location? So yeah, you've got to look at those things, and you've got to make a judgment call, right? Some organizations are under enormous pressures to come up with an SLA and to do it within that time frame, right? So there's only so much you can do. And again, I think you've got to risk assess it, right? And kind of say, hang on a minute, there's some red flags, but is it just the SOC 2 Type 2 report? What else am I getting a feeling, right? I've used those cyber rating platforms. Am I getting something else from that that's a red flag? Their general answers. Am I getting some? And you've got to kind of piece it together as kind of like your full investigation, rather than looking at one thing. And maybe you've got to come back to that, right? So maybe that SOC 2 Type 2 report, you're kind of, hang on a minute, there might be a fourth party involved, or they've mentioned a hosting company that's not a regular one like AWS, because I can go and get SOC 2 Type 2 report easily. So maybe you've got to leave that and say, okay, I'm going to flag that myself. I'm going to maybe say there's a potential issue there. And in the continuous monitoring phase, I may have to come back and dig into that deeper. So I think it really depends if you've got the luxury of time. Generally, I've never seen that luxury of time. So it's kind of, you've got to make that call. You've got to put the pieces of the puzzle together and then kind of say, is this enough to really bring this to someone's attention and try and stop this? Or have I got enough evidence to say, okay, it's a concern, but every vendor should give you a concern, right? They generally are. Or is this something I need to follow up over time? So I think it's every single one is different.
So my last question, the last minute that we've got, is actually initiated by your smile, and it's a very knowing smile, knowing you very well. Is this process that we're talking about here, risk management, Mark, is it an art? Is it a science, or is it a function of experience?
All three, definitely. I think it's, and it always makes me laugh about, risk management. It's another area that we can talk about later. I have some personal feelings that sometimes we see it too much as a science and we overcomplicate things. And I think at the end of the day, I personally like to try and keep things simple. Try to listen to the business. And sometimes it's not always my smart way of thinking. Sometimes it's, I've just been hitting over the head because I've been told there's a PR issue because we need to get down our vendor risk management down to X amount of time. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, how am I going to do that? So I think it's all three. Taking your experiences, right? Looking at the science as much as you can, right? What is the best way of moving this forward? But then definitely an art form as well, right? I've got to come up with something that looks pretty, it's nice and easy for my business to use, and can kind of get the job done adequately. Because sometimes we just don't have the luxury of finite, right? We can't do everything 100% the way we want to do it. It's not the way the business world works.
What a very, very pragmatic answer, and one I certainly would agree with, and very, very interesting. I think we need to leave it there, but for the moment, Mark LoGalbo, VP of Information Security at Fanatics. What a really interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to our next cup of tea, that's for sure.
Pleasure, Dan. Anytime. Thank you.